everyone, it's Priya here, and in today's video I'm going to be showing you how to create a realistic horse portrait using gouache, and I'll also be talking about how you can use basically any medium to create a realistic looking painting or drawing, whether it's a portrait of an animal, person or a landscape. I'll be giving you some tips about that and how to make it look realistic. Now I started off with a regular graphite sketch. I'm using regular graphite pencils or pencil just to create the sketch to use as a guide. Now I'm not using a water soluble graphite pencil because as I apply the paint it's going to basically disappear and I'm not going to have those guides. So I want to have some of those lines show through, so I'm using regular graphite. Now if you are using a gouache, I just want to mention a few things if you want to know, or if you don't know. Gouache can be used in different ways. It can be used more translucent and transparent like watercolors. It can be reactivated like watercolors as well. You can get smooth blends by working wet in wet. So in a lot of respects it's like watercolors, but what makes it different to watercolors is that it can be used opaque. So, or it can be used to be more opaque, where you can use a light color over a dark color and you will still see the light color will show up similar to how acrylic paints show. But it's not permanent. It can be reactivated to a certain extent. But I think because you have the best of both worlds, you can use it opaque as well as transparent or a little bit translucent. All depends on the amount of water that you do add. I think that makes it a very versatile medium. Now, a lot of people believe that, or they think artists, a lot of artists that assume that watercolors and gouache can only be used to create like simple illustrations, and maybe you can't create realistic drawings. Even some people believe that color pencil can't be used for realistic drawings. And the honest truth is, any medium or most mediums, almost all mediums can be used for realistic paintings and drawings, even hyper realistic paintings and drawings, just depending on how you use them. So if you spend enough time working with a medium and trying out different techniques, trying out different methods, and just giving it a try and creating even 10, 20 paintings or drawings and working with that medium and learning what works for that medium, for your type or style of painting, or your type, what you want to achieve, how can you achieve that, and you try it in different methods and try different things, you'll be able to achieve a realistic portrait or drawing or painting from any medium. It all depends on how you use it. So when I started using gouache, I was really surprised at how versatile it is, and I really enjoy the fact that I can be using it opaque as well as transparent, as well as I can build up layers. Now remember, if you're painting realistically, it's not only a matter of mastering how you use the medium or practicing working. That's one part of it. To practice enough, get used to the medium, see how it reacts with water, if you use it with water. It doesn't matter what medium it is, whether it's dry media or whether it's wet mediums and paints, inks. Always try out, the one part is to learn it and see how it works, study it, and really practice enough with it to get an idea of how it works and how it works to your liking and for what you want to create with it. And the other side, to create realistic painting, it has nothing to do with the medium. So the one side has to do with the medium, of how you use it to create those different textures and everything. But on the other hand, you need to have a bit of this, these other knowledge, or these other, keep these in mind, these points that I'm going to mention. You need to keep these in mind when you want to create a realistic drawing or painting. Irrespective whether it's a portrait, landscape, if you want to make it realistic, you need to look at these different things. So the one thing you need to look at is lighting. Lighting is very important. With any subject that you draw, you need to pay attention to where the light is coming from. That will help you to determine where the shadow areas are going to be and where the light or highlighted areas are going to be. So then you know where your shadows are going to be, where your light areas are going to be, or your highlight areas are going to be, where the light is directly hitting the object or the subject, and you'll be able to create the different values needed to build up that three-dimensional look and make it more realistic. Another thing to remember is, especially with animals or people, when you're painting them, you need to look at not only okay, it's a horse, like this I'm painting a horse, and okay, it's a tan color horse and it's got gray hair, that's about it. That's not how you just paint it and it's done. No, you need to build up layers, but you need to make sure that you are looking at the structure, the muscular structure of the animal or the person, the skeletal structure. That will help you also, apart from the lighting, that will also help you to determine where the shadow areas are. That will in the highlight areas, because that will help you create the form of the subject. So for example, a horse has a lot of their shadows on their face, they've got a muscle structure. You need to look at all of that to create that, to make it look realistic. And in order to do that, you need to study your reference photo that you're using and just look at the structure of the animal, and look carefully at how their body muscles are and where the shadows fall on the muscles, for the muscles to depict them, and then paint that as you see it. Another thing you need to know about painting realistically is you need to always make sure that you layer and you take your time. So realistic painting takes time, but it can be done, and it can, as you do more paintings, you get a bit faster, but never try to rush a painting. If you want it to look good, you need to take your time, slowly build the layers, and it's multiple layers. It's not just 1 or 2 layers and then you've got a realistic drawing or painting. No, it's going to take multiple layers of paint, or whatever subject or whatever medium you're using, whatever subject you're doing. You need to do multiple layers of adding shadows and highlights, and then it'll slowly build up, and it'll build the animal or the subject or the portrait that you're trying to depict. You'll slowly build up that 3-dimensional figure or the 3-dimensional look. If it's a landscape, you'll build up that from perspective. All of those can be done in the layering process. And with landscapes, you need to remember it's always perspective, and you always start from the back and move forward. And a tip also for most mediums is always start from light and then move to darker colors or darker values. So start off with your lightest colors and then slowly darken it and add your shadows and build up your shadows by adding darker values of your colors and building up the form that you're trying to paint. Like you can see with this horse, I'm painting with gouache. I'm slowly building up the muscle structure around the neck to the chest area, the muscles on the face as well, where you see the muscle structure and the skeletal structure. I'm bringing that also, looking at my reference, and I'm layering that in slowly. I'm looking at the lighting. The lighting is hitting the horse from the, if you're looking at the painting, is from the left hand side. So I'm now adding shadows on the right hand side. I'm looking at where those shadows fall, how deep are those shadows, do they be needed, or how dark are the shadows, what are the mid-tones that I need to use, or the mid values. And all of that are things that you need to take into consideration. So remember, realistic painting is, or realistic drawings, it depends on a variety of different things. One is how your medium works and how do you make it work to your advantage. That happens only with practice and doing a lot of painting with it and experimentation with it and trial and error and learning from your mistakes and then redoing it and figuring out how it works for your type of painting. The second thing to remember is your lighting. Very important for realistic drawings. Which direction does your lighting come from? The next thing that's very important to remember is also the structure, the muscular structure and the skeletal structure of the animal or person, and perspective. If it's landscapes, you need to pay attention to that, because that will also help you to create the shadows where they need to be and the highlights where they need to be, which will help you to create a more 3-dimensional look and a more 3-dimensional painting. So those are things just to remember when you are painting, that it's not only oh, and there's also, don't forget, it's a layering process. So you slowly build up the layers. Now, as you're building up the layers, also remember, let the layers dry completely between applications. If you want to, you can use a hairdryer to speed drying time up, or you can just let it dry and come back to it later, take a break, maybe have something to eat or something, come back to it. But if you're like me and you want to continuously work and you forget to eat sometimes, then just use a hairdryer, and that speeds up drying time. Now you can see here with the gouache, I'm using it straight from the tube. Now the reason I'm doing this is because I want to get like these really, I want it to really stand out. So my brush does have some water on it, but it's not soaked in water. It's just whatever's left from when I rinsed it. I dabbed it on a paper towel, and then I'm using the gouache. I'm using the paint to layer over, just to create a real opaque layer of the hair, and then I'm going to go in and start layering in the details and some like creating some dimension and even details for the hair afterwards. So that's another thing as well to remember. When you are creating realistic paintings, you need to create some of those areas. You need to look at the details, study your reference really well, and look at the details that are on your painting or on the reference photo, and try to incorporate some of those details onto your painting. Like with this painting, you need to look at where the shadows, where the hair is covering over the face, there's some shadows falling over, you need to bring that into play. If the surroundings have any colors in the surroundings, you need to bring some of that, because light will reflect some of that on the subject, bring some of those colors onto it. So you see, it's not only a few that I mentioned, those few tips that I mentioned for hyper realistic drawings or realistic drawings. I don't do hyper realism, but if you're doing realistic paintings and drawings, you need to look at a lot of different things, because even the environment that they're in, if this horse, for example, was in a green environment and the background was green, I will need to incorporate some of that green background onto the horse itself, maybe onto the hair or the side of the face, because the light that's around it is going to cast a bit of that color onto the subject that you're painting. So always remember, that's also another thing to remember for realistic paintings and drawings, that some of the light for the surroundings will be reflected, or the colors will be on the subject itself. But in this case, there's a gray background, it's very light, so you'll see gray on the hair, but this horse does have gray hair, so that's not a problem. Another thing to remember is always don't be afraid to go very dark with your shadows. If you need to go dark, but always start light and go darker as you progress through your layering process. That way you can slowly develop and go darker as you need, and not go too dark too quickly, because sometimes you go too dark and then afterwards it becomes a problem to add highlights, especially with watercolors. So it's best to, like with gouache, it's okay, because if you do go too dark, you can go over with a lighter color and it will show through, because it can be used more opaque. But with watercolors, for example, you won't have that advantage. You always remember light to dark, and just add those don't feel free to go as dark as you need to go for the shadows, because that will really impact on your realistic paintings and drawings, and it will help it look more realistic. Also, look at the details on your reference photo, like for example, if there's any markings on the horse, like on his face, he's got the white stripe down his face, and he's got or the white patch, and then he's got these little gray spots on it. Add those, because that really adds to the piece. If your portrait you're drawing has freckles, the person has freckles, add those freckles. They really add more dimensional detail to your piece. And also another thing to remember when you're drawing people, or even when you're doing any portraits or of animals, or any even some objects which have light hitting it, remember to keep those lightest whites or the brightest lightest colors that you're going to use. Keep them for your highlights, especially white. Try using a pure white just for the highlight in the eyes, because that really helps the animals come to life as well as portraits. And if an object, if you're doing still life, if the light is hitting directly maybe on an apple, keep the lightest areas on for last to add. If you're using gouache, you can do that. Whereas if you're doing watercolors, then you need to add that, or retain that light areas and not go over it with paint, so that you can obviously have those light areas show at the end. But with gouache, that's fine, you can add the lighter colors afterwards. Now, those are all the different things you need to remember. There's a lot more than that, but those are some of the things that I can think of at this moment to tell you that what you need to do when you want to create a realistic portrait or realistic painting. Even if it's a landscape, there will be highlighted areas or lit up areas that will be light on certain parts of the landscape, or certain objects in the landscape, like on the side of the tree, from the directions that the light is hitting the tree, there will be lighter highlights on that. So all of that you need to look at when you're painting realistically. But one very important thing is the highlight in the eyes. If you're doing a portrait of an animal or a human, a person, you need to include that highlight in the eyes, because that really brings the piece to life and makes them look realistic. Now with this one, you can see I added my layers, I built up my layers, I looked at the direction of the light, I added the shadows accordingly, the values accordingly, I looked at the structure, the muscle structure, the skeletal structure, added the paint as I needed, laid it on, and I was quite happy with it. Looked at the details, but I needed a bit of texture. So I'm using now, once I completely dried the image, I'm using some color pencils just to add a bit of texture to the entire piece. Not a lot, I'm not just adding enough just to get a bit of texture for the fur of the horse. I'm not really trying to get too much of pencil on there, but I just want to really like darken some of the shadows up and have some texture show through as well. But that's my preference for this piece. I could have left it just as it was with gouache, but I just wanted to use some color pencil to add a bit more texture and just to bring out some of those highlights a bit more, or not highlights but more details to it, just to let them stick out a bit more. I think it really adds a bit more dimension to the piece and makes it look a bit more three-dimensional. So those are my tips for painting realistic paintings or realistic drawings for now, whatever I can think of, but there's a lot more that you can look at, but those are where you can start from, and then you can go from there and discover other things as you go along. So I guess that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, don't forget to like and share. Feel free to comment below and don't forget to subscribe. Till the next one. Bye.